In his book, Gradus ad Parnassum, J. Fuchs suggested that certain chromatic alterations were sometimes necessary in order to set up cadences. His basic cadence formula prescribed a minor third or a major sixth going into a cadence. Lydian and Phrygian produced these intervals diatonically according to the key signature. However, using these intervals meant adding a leading tone to Dorian, Mixolydian, or Aeolian. The cadence produced by a minor third or major sixth leading into tonic in Phrygian is curious. This cadence has a subtonic rather than a leading tone going into the final octave. It also has a supertonic leading downward into tonic. Here's an example from Fuchs's book. While more modern modal music often contains cadences where the subtonic resolves into tonic, this was rare in Fuchs's time. If leading tones were so important in establishing tonality, why was this Phrygian cadence acceptable? I think the answer is that the Phrygian cadence does have a leading tone that leads downward into tonic from above. I like to ask my music theory students provocative questions, and one of those questions is, how many leading tones are there in a major scale? The answer they give is 1, from the 7th scale degree to tonic. Then I ask them what makes this a leading tone. What makes it special? They then answer, it forms the interval of a half step, an interval that is rare in a major scale. Okay, so it is rare, but it's not unique. There's also a half step between the 3rd scale degree and the 4th. Is this also a leading tone? My answer is yes, but it's not a leading tone that leads up from the 3rd scale degree to the 4th, but one that leads down from the 4th scale degree to the 3rd. In a way, Fuchs's cadences do all rely on leading tones, most resolving up, but with the Phrygian one leading down. In addition to creating leading tones and cadences, Fuchs also advocated chromaticism to avoid harsh intervals like tritones. Leading tones are one of the primary motivating forces of traditional tonality. Leading tones pull so strongly toward tonic, you could say that they define tonality. And yet it's curious, because Fuchs doesn't talk about leading tones at all. It's as if he's looking for a universal formula for cadences. And since he knows of cadences without leading tones, he doesn't see the concept as universal. Fuchs did not describe the expressive use of chromaticism. That kind of chromaticism generally has one of two purposes. It can represent a temporary change of mode, or a temporary change of tonic via secondary leading tone. The effect of changing modes is often described as a lightening of the sound if the new mode is major, or a darkening of the sound if the new mode is minor. Chromatics involving leading tones became increasingly important in the 18th and 19th centuries. Some composers like Max Reger took this kind of chromaticism to extremes, using these secondary leading tones to change key every measure or two. His two-part canons are great examples of this. Here's one in C major, with my commentary. Note that all of the modulations are accomplished by adding or negating leading tones, or by a change of mode. I will slow down my playing at the key changes, so that you can hear them more clearly. In the early 20th century, composers began to find that leading tone chromaticism was growing stale. A new kind of chromaticism arose that used different chromatics in different voices. Bela Bartok pointed out that this kind of chromaticism had long been available to composers, using the melodic minor scale. Bartok suggested that a similar effect could be produced by having the different voices in different modes at the same time. Here, the upper voice is a descending F Phrygian scale, and the lower voice is an ascending D Dorian scale. While this juxtaposition produces some harsh dissonances, the example is unified by the consonances at its beginning and ending. This kind of chromaticism is often called bimodality because it uses two different modes at the same time, or bitonality because it uses two different key centers. It is sometimes referred to by the blanket term polytonality because it uses multiple key signatures in different voices. Some music theorists reject the concept of polytonality. They argue that music like our example is actually all in the same key. The lower voice shares a tonic with the upper voice and is actually in F Lydian rather than in D Dorian. It's actually not polytonal at all. It merely has chromatic alterations. These theorists have a point. Polytonal music rarely actually sounds like it's in multiple keys at the same time. This is because the two or more modes or keys involved usually share pitches in common. Here, the two voices share the pitches F and C. The excerpt ends in the bottom voice with an E going to an F, thus creating a leading tone cadence. The upper voice moves from G flat to F. This creates the strong impression that the example ends in F. The polytonality creates chromatic contrast rather than the impression that two different keys are sounding at once. Bartok himself agreed. He explained that the notes in common between the two keys caused the different voices to blend together. This was not a problem for Bartok because he wasn't trying to create the impression of multiple tonalities, but was instead trying to create new chromatic effects. The concept of polytonality helped him to keep straight which chromatics should appear in which voices. An analysis of Bartok's first bagatelle for piano makes this clear. The key signature of the upper part contains 4 sharps, C sharp minor, while the key signature of the lower part contains 4 flats, C Phrygian. This gives the different voices 3 pitches in common. It may seem that 3 common pitches are not enough to give the piece a kind of tonal unity, but Bartok plays off of the differences between E natural and C sharp minor and E flat and C Phrygian. His cadences in measures 3, 5, 12, 14, and 18 all link the C in the bottom part with the E natural in the upper part, thus creating a Picardy third. In effect, the piece is in C Phrygian with chromatics in the upper part. Examples of polytonality from other composers show a similar approach. Darius Milhaud is renowned for his use of polytonality. His works often approach a total separation of key between voices. Botafogo, from Mio's Saudades de Brazil, presents a bass line consisting of tonic and dominant in F minor as a foundation for a melody in F sharp minor. The clash between the two keys is extreme, until the cadence, where Mio simply slides the C sharp in the upper part down a half step to C, so it doesn't clash with the F minor triad in the bass. Like many composers, Mio doesn't want to completely destroy tonic. He adjusts his polytonal scheme to support tonic at cadence points. Gustav Holst used a similar approach at the end of the first movement from his second set of hymns from the Rig Veda. Holst placed the choir in E minor, but floated above it a solo violin melody based on a whole tone scale. Holst placed Chromaticism in the choral part as well, with a C minor chord and then an harmonically respelled G sharp minor. Both parts came together at the end in E minor. Polytonality is not only common in 20th century concert music, it also appears in jazz and popular music. In a standard blues progression, the accompaniment is based on a series of 1 and 4 chords, F and B flat in an F blues. The bass player will often improvise a bass line to match those harmonies by playing F and B flat Mixolydian scales. At the same time, a soloist might improvise using the pitches of an F blues scale. The blues scale is a minor pentatonic scale with an added raised fourth. The raised fourth is dissonant with the Mixolydian scales, and the third of the blues scale, the A flat, clashes with the A natural of the F Mixolydian scale in the bass. This type of polytonality happens often in all kinds of popular music, where soloists play blues-based improvisations that are not linked to the scales used in the bass lines or to the chord changes. Many composers in the early 20th century were not satisfied with polytonality. They pushed instead for a new kind of universal chromaticism, pantonality or atonality. This was codified into something known as dissonant counterpoint. Codified is perhaps too strong a word. It was taught at the University of California by Charles Seeger. Henry Cowell describes it in his book, New Musical Resources. Major sevenths and minor sevenths and ninths would be foundation intervals. Major seconds and ninths, diminished fifths, and minor sevenths would be used as alternatives. All thirds, fourths, fifths, and sixths would only be permitted as passing or auxiliary notes. The development of harmony has, since the time of Bach, gone so far in the direction of dissonance that effects that were in his time regarded as dissonant tend to be now accepted as essentially consonant. Bach, as well as even earlier composers, in their rules, tended to reject the most obvious consonant intervals, such as open octaves, fifths, and fourths, employing the more dissonant material. Early contrapuntalists did not, of course, entirely reject fifths and fourths from their music. A fifth might, and in fact must, appear as the outer member of a major triad. But the presence of the third lying between was considered to remove the too open effect of the fifth alone. Similarly, the fourth appeared as part of the first or second inversion of the triad. In the same way, in dissonant counterpoint, all simpler consonant intervals would be permitted, if accompanied at the same time with a seventh, second, or ninth. Thus, thirds and sixths would not be cut out of music, but would merely have additional intervals added to them. British composer Reginald Smith Brindle described a similar approach that he called interval harmony. To demonstrate this technique, I will start out with the cantus firmus comprised of a 12-tone row. Under this, I'll add a second voice, made up entirely of consonances. In order to create dissonant counterpoint, I'll add a third voice using only mild dissonances, major seconds and minor sevenths. We could stop at this point, or we could continue by adding more voices, or by making the dissonances more acute. This example is written in first species counterpoint. In order to turn it into real music, it requires rhythmic differences between the voices in order to give them some shape and independence. This should be done with care, so that the equilibrium of dissonance is maintained. When an equilibrium of dissonance is maintained, the effect is one of all dissonance all the time. This contrasts strongly with the traditional style of counterpoint, where music moves in and out of consonance and dissonance, and the dissonances are often used to help structure the music. That's generally not the case with dissonant counterpoint. In dissonant counterpoint, the level of dissonance remains the same throughout the piece. This dissonant harmony does not produce chord progressions, it produces a continuum.